The radio died at 6:14 in the morning, not gradually, not with static that softened into white noise the way a storm radio loses a station when you drive too far from the tower. It died the way a man dies when something vital gives out. One moment there was a voice, and then there was nothing. A hard cut. An absence so complete it pressed against the canvas walls of the forward operating base like a physical weight. The voice had belonged to Master Chief Brent Calloway. What remained of his transmission had lasted 11 seconds. 3 words were intelligible. The rest was terrain-shredded interference, the noise that only came from one place on the regional map. Gray Line 12. The operators looked at each other across the communications table. Nobody reached for the dial. Nobody attempted to reconnect. They had learned in the months since this deployment began that there was no point trying to reach anything inside that valley. You didn't get signals out of Gray Line 12. You got silence. And silence in that particular canyon had a meaning that everyone in the tent already understood without needing to say it aloud. 6 hours earlier, the world had been manageable. 6 hours earlier, Calloway's team had been moving northeast along a route they had walked 3 times before. Routine reconnaissance, scheduled extraction, the kind of mission that fills the quiet weeks between the ones that matter. Nobody had flagged the intelligence changes. Nobody had noted the shift in movement patterns along the eastern ridge. The analysts had seen what they expected to see and written what they expected to write, and the men on the ground had walked into something that the paper never warned them about. Now 6 men were somewhere inside a canyon that the United States military had informally designated a dead zone, not because of the terrain. Terrain could be managed. Pilots trained for bad terrain their entire careers. The canyon earned its designation from what had happened to the ones who went in after people who needed help. A surveillance drone gone, a scout helicopter gone, an entire patrol gone. Each loss had generated a report. Each report had generated a recommendation. Each recommendation had said the same thing in different language. Do not enter Gray Line 12. The rule was not written in any official document with a stamp and a chain of command attached. It lived in the memory of every person who had served in this region, passed down the what rules that actually matter are always passed not through paperwork, but through the look on a senior officer's face when a junior one asked the question that should not need asking. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the back of the tent and read the map. He was 61 years old, which was old for a man still drawing operational duty in a region like this. He had stayed because he was good at what he did, and because the Army had let him stay, and because he had never found a reason compelling enough to stop. He was not a large man. He did not fill a room with volume or theater. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and read the map the way a doctor reads a scan, looking not at what was there, but at what the shape of it implied. Gray Line 12, northeast approach, 6 men, 1 transmission, 11 seconds. He already knew what he was going to have to do. He was giving himself a moment to be the kind of man who thought it through first. Options, he said. He did not raise his voice. The tent gave him what it had, which was not much, which he had already known. Another team on foot would take 4 hours minimum, and the tactical picture inside the valley would be unrecognizable by then. Regional Command Air Support required clearance from 3 offices and 2 hours of bureaucratic movement in the best circumstances. Secondary frequency contact was already being attempted by 3 operators and producing nothing. Or they could find someone who knew how to fly into places where other pilots did not go. It was Lieutenant Nolan Kerrigan who said the name. He was 29 years old, the youngest man in the tent by a decade, and he said it the way young officers say things they are uncertain they are permitted to say quietly with a downward inflection, offering it for consideration rather than recommendation. There's someone, he said. Major Voss. She flew Gray Line 12 2 years ago. Made it through solo. The tent went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Webb turned from the map. He looked at Kerrigan for a long moment. Not unkindly, with the full weight of his attention, which carried its own pressure. Status, Webb said. Kerrigan checked the roster on his tablet. The entry was not where personnel entries usually were. It had been moved to a separate classification that required additional access to view and generated an automatic notification when opened. He found it. He read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Temporarily restricted from flight operations, he said, pending review. How long has the review been pending? Kerrigan looked at the date. 22 months. Webb turned back to the map. He looked at Gray Line 12 for 3 more seconds. Then he made the decision the situation had already made for him. Where is she? Kerrigan had started toward the door when something made him pause. He had been cross-referencing the logistical support requests filed for the region Over the past 6 weeks, building the supply picture in case extraction required equipment not on base. He had found what he was looking for and then noticed something adjacent that he had not been looking for. A terminal in the FOB's logistics block had accessed the regional manpad's inventory database at 0340 that morning. No user account attached. No authorization flag triggered. The access had lasted 11 seconds and pulled a single record. He stared at it. Then he wrote the timestamp in the margin of his notepad, drew a small circle around it, and went back to what Webb needed him to do. It was probably a system error, a ghost query, a clock sync anomaly, something mundane. He would look at it again when Calloway's team was out of the canyon. He did not look at it again for 2 hours. By then, the answer it pointed to would be considerably harder to ignore. He jogged to Hangar 4. Hangar 4 sat at the eastern edge of the flight line with the quality of a place quietly abandoned without anyone formally deciding to abandon it. The overhead lights ran at 70% capacity. The floor carried oil stains that maintenance crews had stopped trying to remove because the aircraft that made them had been moved to other facilities long ago. Equipment racks along the north wall held parts for aircraft no longer assigned to the base. The exception was a single A-10 Thunderbolt II parked at the western end of the hangar floor. It had no unit designation on the tail. Several panels were unpainted bare aluminum, showing in irregular patches that caught the fluorescent light at odd angles. A long scored mark ran along the underside of the left wing root, not a crack, but adjacent to one, in a way that a new crew chief would have flagged immediately. The crew chiefs here, long enough to know the aircraft's history, did not flag it. They understood without being told that the scar was part of the record, and the record was not their business to judge. The aircraft's name was Tempest 3. It had not flown in 22 months. Major Claire Voss was sitting on a dented aluminum bench 10 feet from the aircraft's nose when the sun came up. She was 52 years old. She wore a flight suit that was regulation in every technical sense, and somehow not quite regulation in the way she wore it unzipped 4 inches at the collar, sleeves pushed to the elbow. The small violations that accumulate over years of not being watched closely and not particularly caring whether you are watched. Her hair was silver at the temples and pulled back in a practical knot. There were shadows under her eyes that had been there long enough to stop being shadows and start being features. She was holding something in her left hand. Not looking at it, just holding it. It was a set of dog tags. The metal had worn past silver into a muted gray that only comes from decades of contact with skin. The stamped letters were legible if you held them at the right angle, but Claire Voss had not needed to read them since she was 9 years old. Voss Elliot J. 03/RF4C USAF. Her father had been a reconnaissance pilot, a good one by every account she had ever received, and the accounts had been rare enough that each one had lodged in her memory like a piece of shrapnel, small, impossible to fully remove. He had flown RF-4C Phantoms out of a base in West Germany during the final hard years of the Cold War, when the rules about where American aircraft were and were not permitted to fly were absolute on paper and routinely flexible in practice. The military needed eyes in certain places. He had been the pilot who could put a camera over those places and bring it home. Until November of 1983, when he had not come home. The official record was brief. Captain Elliot Voss had been on an authorized training exercise. His aircraft had experienced an unspecified mechanical failure. He was listed as missing, presumed dead, no further information available. The notification came to her mother in a beige envelope with a government return address, and her mother had sat at the kitchen table for a long time without opening it, as if understanding that the act of opening it would make something true. That was still, for as long as the envelope remained sealed, merely likely. What the official record did not say, what no official record would ever say because the mission did not officially exist, was that a search and rescue team had picked up Captain Voss's emergency beacon for 14 hours after his aircraft went down. 14 hours. The signal had been consistent, strong, unambiguous. It had been tracked to a specific location in a sector that created complications for the people whose job it was to manage complications. The rescue had not been dispatched. Someone had made a decision. In the architecture of authority that governs what a government does and does not do, a person with the necessary clearance had determined that the location of the downed aircraft and the political cost of a rescue in that particular sector outweighed the life of one RF-4C pilot. The decision had been made in a room Claire Voss would never be permitted to enter. It had been made about her father. It had never been explained because the official record said training exercise and mechanical failure, and that was considered sufficient. She had been 9 years old. She had grown up knowing, not through documentation or testimony, but through the accumulated weight of things, not said conversations that stopped when she entered a room the look certain older pilots gave her when they learned her last name. She had grown up with that knowledge and done the only thing that made sense with it. She had become a pilot, not to find her father. He was gone. 14 hours in a downed aircraft in the wrong sector. In 1983, she had made her peace with the arithmetic of that, or something close enough to peace that she could function. She became a pilot because the alternative was to be the person who stands on the ground and watches the sky and wonders. She was not that person. She needed to be inside the machine where the questions were immediate and answerable, and the things you could not fix were at least clearly visible. She was good at it from the first hour of her first training flight, with a certainty that surprised her instructor and did not surprise her at all. There were pilots who were skilled and pilots who were natural, and the distinction was legible from the outside if you knew what to look for. She was natural. She could feel the aircraft the way some people claim to feel, weather coming not as information from instruments but as something arriving through her hands. Lieutenant Colonel James Harker had been the first person to say it plainly. He had been her advanced tactics instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in 2011, a lean, quiet man who had spent 15 years flying in places that did not appear in official briefings. He had watched her complete the canyon navigation exercise 20 minutes faster than the course record at an altitude that made the safety observers grip their clipboards, and he had said without inflection, "You fly like someone who needs to be in there more than she needs to get out." She had understood exactly what he meant. She had spent 43 years thinking about what kind of person makes the decision her father's commanders made. Not in the obsessive way that grief sometimes calcifies into fixation. In the patient working way of someone who has filed a question under unresolved and checks it periodically, the way a pilot checks an instrument still reading but not yet confirmed accurate. She heard the footsteps before she saw Kerrigan making them. She recognized the pattern, someone young moving fast and trying not to show it. She did not look up from the aircraft. "Major Voss." He stopped 6 feet away slightly, out of breath. "Colonel Webb requests your presence at the communications tent." "Request?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." A moment passed. Outside the hangar, the desert was turning gold at the edges. "What's in gray line 12? Kerrigan was quiet for 2 seconds. That was enough. She stood. She placed the dog tags in her left brace pocket and pressed the internal clip closed with her thumb, the same motion she had performed before every flight she had ever made, the same sequence that her hands completed before her mind had finished the thought. She straightened and walked past Kerrigan and out into the early morning. Inside the communications tent, the map was on the wall, and Calloway's last coordinates were circled in red marker, and Webb was standing the way he stood when the math had already been done, and he was waiting for the room to catch up. He watched her come in. He took in the flight suit and the absence of rank theater, and the stillness she carried, not the stillness of calm, but of someone accustomed to controlling exactly how much they showed. He did not offer her a chair. "You flew the Grave Cut in November 2024, he said. "Yes." "Solo. No escort, no clearance." "That's what the report says." His jaw moved slightly. "I'm not reading you the report, Major. I'm asking you a question." "Then ask it." 3 operators at the communications table found urgent reasons to focus on their equipment. "If you went in now," Webb said, "could you reach them?" It was not phrased as a question. That was the right way to phrase it. She looked at the map. She read the topography lines with automatic fluency, elevation changes translating instantly into approach angles. Wind behavior, the geometry of a space that had been designed by geology to kill the things that entered it. Gray Line 12 was 260 feet wide at the narrowest navigable point. The crosswind behavior was generated by 3 thermal columns that intersected at unpredictable angles. The floor rose 14 feet, over 300 meters in the middle section, which meant a pilot could not maintain a flat approach and had to adjust continuously against gravity while managing lateral forces that had flipped aircraft against the walls before their pilots understood what was happening. She had flown it twice. The first time with Harker guiding her through on the radio. The second time alone in deteriorating conditions with one engine already running hot. "Yes," she said. Webb nodded once. He already knew what she was going to do. He had simply needed to hear her say it. "You're on review status. I can't authorize this. I won't authorize this." "I know." "If you take that aircraft—" "I know," she said again. Webb reached into his breast pocket and removed a single sheet of paper. He did not hand it to her. He set it on the edge of the communications table face down in the space between him and the operators. "I'm going to get coffee," he said. "Kerrigan, walk with me." He left. Kerrigan hesitated 1 second, then followed. Claire looked at the paper on the table. She did not turn it over. She understood what it was, not the content, but the category. Webb had been carrying something he could not officially give her and had found the only way to place it near her without being the one to put it in her hands. A man who had spent 3 decades navigating the gap between what the regulations permitted and what the situation required. She left the paper where it was and walked back to Hangar 4. The desert morning had arrived fully, that particular quality of early light in high arid country where every surface is defined by its shadow and the sky seems 10% closer than it should be. Her boots made even sounds on the concrete. She did not walk quickly. The person who moves at the speed the situation demands, rather than the speed that fear demands, is communicating something specific, and she was precise about what she communicated. She stood before Tempest 3 and looked at it the way she always looked at aircraft before she flew them, with assessment that was half technical and half something older and less nameable. She walked the full circuit, running her left hand along the surfaces. The scored mark under the wing root still not a crack. The panel seems no new separation. The cannon housing clean. She stopped at the fuel gauge visible through the lower panel access port. It read full. The last maintenance log entry, which she had read 3 weeks ago, which she had been reading periodically for months, had listed fuel state at 40% from residual remaining after the November mission. Someone had refueled the aircraft. She checked the hydraulic fluid full and clear, not the amber of fluid degraded by extended storage. Someone had replaced it. The portside avionics panel that had been flickering irregularly since the November mission responded cleanly when she ran the diagnostic cycle. She stood in the hangar with all of this arranged in her mind. The aircraft had been prepared. Not this morning, the work was not fresh enough for this morning. Within the last several days, every marginal system was now functional. Every degraded fluid was clean. Someone had invested time and knowledge in this aircraft with deliberate care. She had a thought about who. She held the thought carefully, the way you hold a conclusion you are not ready to act on yet, and climbed into the cockpit. The canopy smelled of fuel and electronics in the particular signature of a cockpit that had been lived in over years of high-altitude flight. She settled into the seat with the ease of something that had never been foreign to her body. Her hands moved across the panel switch positions. Indicator states the tactile map of an aircraft she knew as well as any room she had ever lived in. She reached into her left breast pocket and took out the dog tags. She held them for a moment, not reading them, simply feeling the weight that 43 years had made familiar, and set them in the small padded recess to the left of the main display. Harker had shown her that recess in 2011, a deliberate space built into this specific airframe variant by a maintenance crew that had flown too many missions without something to hold on to. The tags settled against the padding with a sound that was very small and very particular, the sound of something finding its place. The engine startup sequence began under her hands. Systems came online. Diagnostics scrolled fuel at 100% and hydraulics optimal, cannon green flares, green both stabilizers nominal. Tempest 3, you are not cleared for engine start. Identify. She did not answer. Tempest 3, respond, or I will dispatch ground crew to your position. She released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward with the deliberateness of a person who has passed the point of reconsidering. The aircraft rolled out of Hangar 4 into the morning light. She felt the engine sound shift as the nose came around toward the runway and the desert opened ahead. Who the hell just taxied? A different controller, now the voice carrying the sound of someone who had looked out a window and seen something that should not be moving. Eyes on Hangar 4, someone is on the runway. She was already accelerating. The desert fell away beneath her. The concrete gave way to altitude, the horizon pulling back and expanding the base, resolving into geometry rather than a place. She banked east and climbed, and the radio filled with voices that she stopped listening to because the voices were about procedure, and procedure was the reason Brent Calloway's team had been in a canyon for 6 hours. Inside the communications tent, a radar operator watched a blip drop below the detection threshold and said very quietly, "She's under radar floor." Webb came back in with a paper coffee cup. He looked at the radar display. He looked at the map. He looked at Kerrigan, who was already back at his station, the notepad open in front of him, the small circled timestamp from 0340 still waiting in the margin. "Keep her channel clear," Webb said. "If she calls, give her everything." Nobody argued. Above the desert, 52 years old and flying for the first time in 22 months, Major Claire Voss leveled off at 200 feet and pointed Tempest 3 northeast. Ahead of her 31 kilometers, a narrow wound in the earth waited between walls of stone. She had flown it twice. She knew every crosswind pocket, every place where the instruments gave readings that the terrain made false, every section where only the hands could be trusted. She knew these things because a quiet man had taught her standing at a chalkboard, and then at a taxiway, and then beside a canyon entrance at dawn, repeating things until she had them not in her memory but in her body. She pushed the throttle forward. The canyon entrance rose ahead, stone walls sharp against the pale morning sky. The engines of Tempest 3 crossed the desert at a pitch that carried. They would hear it in the canyon. She intended that. The canyon entrance did not announce itself dramatically. It happened the way bad situations always happen, incrementally, each degree of change small enough to seem manageable until the point of no return had passed several minutes ago, and the only direction that made sense was forward. Claire dropped to 160 feet and felt the aircraft settle into the lower air. At altitude, you fought the sky. Down here, you negotiated with it. Every pressure change registered through the controls before it registered on instruments, and the instruments were running half a second behind what her hands already knew. She had killed the proximity alarms before she cleared the canyon entrance. Continuous noise was not information. It was interference. 260 feet wall-to-wall at the narrowest point. She did not look at the walls directly. Looking at walls was what inexperienced low-altitude pilots did, and it was why they died, the eye fixed on the threat, and the hands followed the eye, and the aircraft followed the hands into the stone. She looked through the gap at where she was going, and her peripheral awareness handled the walls the way a well-trained reflex handles anything sufficiently practiced automatically as data, rather than spectacle. The first firing position came up at 40 seconds inside the canyon. She had not needed thermal optics to find it. The shadow pattern on the eastern wall was wrong, too regular, too deliberate in the way it broke the natural randomness of fractured rock. Figures crouched behind an outcrop 40 meters above the canyon floor, two of them tubes across their shoulders. In a silhouette, she had learned to read the way birders read wing shapes by angle and context immediately and without deliberation. She did not announce the pass. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke with a sound less like a weapon firing and more like something fundamental, being briefly interrupted, a rolling massive thunder that existed at a frequency you felt in your sternum before your ears processed it. A line of fire crossed the stone. Dust burst outward in a gray-white plume. The outcrop changed shape. The figures did not move again. Fuel at 91%, left display flickering at the margin of her vision. She banked left 6 degrees, held it 2 seconds, corrected. The canyon floor rose slightly here, 14 feet over 300 meters, the gradient that instruments always reported a fraction late, because the rate of change fell below the automatic alert threshold. Her hands had already made the correction before the altimeter confirmed the drift. Callaway's last coordinates were 2 kilometers northeast. She was 400 meters into the canyon when the comms crackled on a frequency that was not in the operational map. Not Webb's channel, not the tower. The signal was clean in a way that suggested proximity rather than equipment quality, and the voice that came through it was steady to the point of being nearly conversational, the tone of someone conveying information they fully expected would be acted on correctly. Don't take the main corridor. Eastern approach has a thermal trap at the second bend. She covered 60 meters in the time it took to process the words. She checked the thermal optics. The second bend was 300 meters ahead. The display showed a heat signature she had initially read as residual rock temperature diffuse warmth that stone retained from the previous day's sun. She read it again with the frame the voice had given her. The pattern was wrong for passive stone heat, too concentrated, too regular in distribution. It had the signature of something mechanical, stationary, long enough to begin matching ambient temperature, but not long enough to complete the process. A dug-in launcher array, multiple units in a spread pattern designed to catch an aircraft committed to the main corridor. She adjusted her approach 11 degrees left and dropped to 140 feet. The alternative line through the canyon was tighter, 190 feet of clearance rather than 260, and the floor was uneven in ways the chart only partially captured. But it kept the rock face between her and the thermal trap long enough to reduce the targeting window to something unworkable. She flew through the tight section by feel. The right wingtip cleared the wall by a margin she did not look at directly. She did not respond to the voice on the impossible frequency. Not yet. She stored the fact of it, the accuracy of the intelligence, the position that required physical presence in the terrain to possess the tone that carried neither urgency nor theater, but simply the clean clarity of someone giving a student what they need and trusting the student to use it. She had one thought about who it was. She folded the thought and held it and kept flying. Inside the canyon in the third section, Where the walls were lower and light came down in angled columns, the SEAL team was not at the coordinates of Callaway's last transmission. They had moved 40 meters southeast, not far, but far enough that it was the right decision. They were in the remnants of a stone livestock enclosure, walls 3 feet high, and partially collapsed sandbags filling the gaps in a pattern that spoke of urgency working alongside competence. The enclosure faced north and east, giving coverage against the primary approach, while exposing the south to a ridge that was as far as she could read currently clear. The thermal display showed 6 heat signatures inside the enclosure. She read them automatically. 5 were consistent body temperature movement patterns, indicating men under fire doing the deliberate things that training demanded. The 6th was different. The heat concentration in the thoracic region was wrong. Too much warmth in the chest, the arms and legs running cooler than they should, which happened when circulation was compromised, which happened when something was preventing the body from distributing heat normally. Brent Callaway was bleeding internally. She understood this in less than a second, with a completeness that required no additional analysis. She had seen that thermal signature before in different terrain on a different display years ago. She knew what it meant, and she knew the timeline it indicated. 20 minutes, possibly less. Her left hand dropped from the throttle. Not intentionally, the body completing something the mind was still arriving at. Her palm pressed flat against the edge of the recess beside the main display, against the metal of the dog tags resting there. She did not lift them. She pressed against them the way you press a hand to something still warm, when it should have gone cold, confirming a temperature you are not sure you believe. 1983, November, 14 hours. Her father had lain in a downed aircraft in hostile terrain for 14 hours. His signal had transmitted continuously, strong and unambiguous, tracked to a specific location. A person in a room somewhere above the situation had looked at the cost and made a choice. She pushed the throttle. She came on the main frequency for the first time since leaving Harrogate. Her voice was flat and certain, not the voice of someone looking for confirmation, but of someone transmitting a fact. Indigo 5 Tempest 3, your lead has 20 minutes. Don't let him sit down. Static. 3 seconds. Then a voice she recognized from 2 years ago, from a different emergency, from a different stretch of impossible terrain, where she had also arrived without being asked. It was lower now, rougher at the edges. But it had the same quality, the quality of a man who had made his peace with bad situations and dealt with them. Copy. 1 word. She knew what it cost him to say it at the volume he could manage. She heard what was underneath it. She pulled up, embanked, and went back to work. The second firing position was not where she expected. These men had heard the cannon and they had moved intelligently, split into 2 elements, one against the eastern wall in a position defensible against ground approach, but exposed to an aerial pass from the north, one gone south along the ridge to a position that was not exposed to that pass. She read this in the time available. She took the exposed element first. The pass was tighter than she would have chosen in better conditions. The canyon ran 300 feet wall-to-wall in this section, but the usable corridor given the positions of the firing elements was effectively half that, and the crosswind at this section had a rotational component. She felt through the yoke before the instruments confirmed it, a spiraling pressure pushing the nose right and down simultaneously. She held the correction with her left hand while her right managed the throttle. The cannon fired in 2 short bursts, dust and stone, silence from that position. The second element had better cover, and she understood she would not clear it cleanly on the first pass. She made the approach low and fast enough to make targeting her from the ridge a difficult proposition, noted the position precisely, and continued northeast. Fuel at 78%, hydraulics holding. She came back for the third pass with a different calculation. The enclosure was 40 meters below and southeast. Between her current position and the enclosure, 3 positions on the northern approach had active shooters with the geometry to put rounds into the sandbag walls from angles the barriers did not fully address. She cleared the northern positions in 90 seconds. 2 passes adjusted between them for the repositioning of the remaining element, which had tried to relocate to ground that gave them no advantage they had not already surrendered. The canyon went quiet around the enclosure. Not the quiet of safety, the qualified quiet of a pause. The silence that experienced fighters do not trust, because it usually means one of 2 things. Either the threat is gone or it is repositioning for something worse. She was climbing to reacquire the broader picture when Kerrigan came on the main frequency. His voice was controlled in a way that required visible effort, the control audible in the compression of it. Tempest 3 Harrogate, rotary detach inbound, 2 Chinooks. 14 minutes to LZ, wind southwest at 12. LZ is open. 14 minutes was manageable if she could keep the ridge lines clear. She began the transit toward the landing zone. She had been in the canyon 11 minutes, fuel at 64%. She was two-thirds through the eastern transit when the thermal display caught signatures on the southern ridge she had not seen before because they had not been there before, or more precisely because they had been sufficiently still and cool to fall below the passive scan threshold. They had moved recently. Three signatures tucked into the rockfall on the southern face, and their angle was oriented upward and east, not toward the canyon floor, toward the flight corridor that incoming rotary aircraft would have to use. She looked at the signature size consistent with a crew-served equipment, not individual weapons. She looked at the angle and she understood what she was looking at before the understanding was fully formed in language. The Chinooks would not see this position from their approach. The southern ridge would be behind them and below their sensor coverage. Their first indication of the threat would be the launch itself. She pushed the throttle to full and rolled left. Tempest 3 engaging southern ridge. No preamble, no request. The words were information about what was already in progress. The dive toward the southern ridge was steep. She fired in short, controlled burst positions separated, so sustained fire would clear one and give the others the seconds they needed to acquire her. One element broke left, one broke right. The third held its position, and she watched the shoulder mount come up, and she understood before the launch that this one was not going to move. The launch signature was unmistakable. The track was not on her. She had an instant, real, and definite not comfortable to understand the geometry. The missile was tracking toward the eastern flight corridor. The Chinooks were in the eastern flight corridor. The Chinooks had not yet acquired the launch because it had come from behind and below. She rolled Tempest 3 hard right and pulled toward the missile's track line. This was not a decision in the way decisions are usually experienced. The body completing a calculation, the mind had already finished acting on the result without waiting for confirmation. She put the aircraft between the missile and the helicopters the way you put your hand over a flame without deliberating about temperature, because the alternative is that something burns that should not burn. The heat seeker found her engines and committed. The track shifted. Now it was on her. The canyon was ahead. She did not go up. Up was where the missile expected her to go, where physics suggested she should go, where every trained instinct pointed. She went down toward the floor and the walls, and she flew the canyon the way she had flown it for 14 minutes, by feel, by the knowledge Harker had given her, by what she had verified twice in conditions very much like these. The alarms would have been screaming if she had not already disabled them. What came through her earpiece was not an alarm. It was Webb's voice stripped to 2 words. Come on. She heard it as what it was, an old soldier watching a radar screen, doing the only thing available to him, which was to want as hard as wanting it allows for the right outcome. The canyon curved. She rode the curve. The missile rode it with her, losing trace fractions of tracking, certainty on each deviation, each heading change bleeding a marginal amount from its lock. Not enough. The warhead was designed for deviations. It was within kill range in 13 seconds. She saw the rock face. Harker had drawn it on a napkin in a debriefing room at Nellis in 2011, sitting across from her with coffee going cold on the table. He had drawn it in 3 strokes, the curve, the floor, dropped the wall that came in from the right, and he had said this is the one that kills people. Not because it's the hardest section, because it's the most deceptive. It looks like a straight corridor. It is not. She had the napkin in her memory, every line of it. She flew the deceptive section at full throttle, 110 feet above the floor, trusting the drawing a man she trusted had made 15 years ago. She pulled vertical with everything the airframe had left, both hands on the stick back, pressed into the seat by forces that narrowed the visual field to a gray-edged tunnel. Tempest 3 cleared the rock face with a margin she did not have time to measure. The missile did not have the napkin. The detonation was simultaneous with the shockwave. She felt the aircraft thrown laterally before she heard the sound, a displacement, a pressure change, moving through the airframe like current through water, followed by noise that registered as something between a thunderclap and a physical blow. Stone fragments struck the fuselage in the half-second after detonation, multiple impacts distributed across the underside that she felt more than heard. One engine coughed, not dead, interrupted. It recovered in 4 seconds that were longer than 4 seconds. She held the aircraft, both hands, every correction immediate and imprecise and entirely necessary, the opposite of elegant, the kind of flying that looks from outside like barely controlled falling and feels from inside like an argument with physics. You are winning by a narrower margin than you would prefer. Tempest 3 stabilized at 230 feet. The canyon was behind her. She exhaled once. The breath of someone performing a function rather than expressing a feeling. Fuel at 41%. Left engine temperature elevated, but within parameters. Left display dark. Right display covering the function she needed. Below and ahead, the landing zone was a flat brown rectangle in the terrain. Moving inside it, actually moving, crossing the open ground in the ragged but deliberate motion of people who had heard an engine and made a decision was Callaway's team. 4 men on their feet, 2 men on a stretcher being carried by the others. Moving southeast at the best speed their injuries and exhaustion allowed. She came down on the main frequency, and her voice had the quality of a person who has just done something very difficult and has no particular interest in discussing it. Indigo 5 Tempest 3, I see you, keep moving, 12 minutes. The voice that came back was younger than Callaway's, carrying the strain of a man covering a retreat while others managed the stretcher. Tempest movement on the northern ridge, one element at least 4 paralleling our position. She was already reading it on thermal. 4 signatures northeast repositioning for a firing line into the LZ before the helicopters arrived. Not Manpad's body size and movement pattern indicated rifles and 1 crew-served weapon. Enough to make a helicopter landing difficult. Not enough to stop it if the air above was controlled. She banked north and climbed to position. The northern element had found a natural depression in the ridge face, a shallow bowl in rock that gave 3-sided protection in a clear line to the LZ. She made 1 pass and assessed and understood that the depression required her to come from the west at an angle that cut across its natural geometry. This meant crossing the ridge line at a point briefly exposed to whatever lay on the other side. She went over the ridge at 250 feet. Nothing on the other side except empty terrain. The pass worked. The cannon reached the center of the depression, and the element broke 2 men running northeast, 2 down. The crew-served weapon did not fire again. She came around and checked the fuel. 34%. In the communications tent, Kerrigan was watching 2 radar blips simultaneously, the inbound Chinooks and Tempest 3, moving in a pattern that corresponded to no standard close air support doctrine he had been trained on. He had stopped trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the parameters he knew. He was simply watching and keeping the channel clear and waiting. The first Chinook called its approach. 3 minutes to LZ. 40 seconds later, Voss came on the frequency. Not directed at anyone specifically. Simply information placed on the channel for anyone who needed it. Southern ridge clear, northern element clear, eastern corridor clear. LZ has 1 possible position in the rockfall at bearing 170 assessed minimal. Recommend immediate approach. Kerrigan relayed to the Chinook flight lead. He heard the flight lead process it in the 2-second pause before accepting a tactical picture painted entirely by a single aircraft that was not supposed to be airborne. Copy Tempest, approaching now. The first Chinook came in from the northeast low and fast, and then flaring dramatically at the edge of the LZ in the way heavy rotary aircraft flare an ungainly deceleration that looked from a distance like controlled falling. The rear ramp was already descending. Rotor wash hit the ground and threw a curtain of pale dust that rolled outward in a brown wall. Callaway's team reached the LZ with 40 seconds to spare. The stretcher went up the ramp first. Then 3 men. Then the rear guard moving backward with a weapon still at the shoulder, the backward walk of a man who has not yet decided to stop being a soldier and has simply been directed by circumstances to move in a particular direction. The ramp came up. The Chinook lifted. She stayed over the valley until both helicopters had cleared the canyon entrance. She watched them on the thermal display and through the canopy glass, simultaneously checking the minimal position at bearing 170 continuously. It did not move, did not fire. When the second helicopter's rotor sound had faded from the specific pitch that meant inside effective range to the lower pitch, that meant clear, she checked her instruments. Fuel 26%. Left engine temperature elevated but holding. The dark left display. The stabilizers nominal. She turned southwest and began the transit back toward FOB Harrow Gate. The canyon fell behind her. The walls that had been immediate and particular dissolved into topography lines on a map in elevation reading a designation. The grave cut, dead zone. She had been inside it for 22 minutes. She thought about the voice on the impossible frequency. The specific knowledge it had given her, accurate and timely describing a position that required physical presence in the terrain to know. You could not read a static map and know where a thermal trap had been positioned that morning. You had to be close. You had to have eyes on the canyon in real time. You had to know the canyon well enough to read it the way a man reads country he has walked for years. She thought about one person she had ever known who knew the grave cut with that depth of familiarity. The person who had taken her through it the first time. The person who had drawn a napkin diagram that had just saved her life. She held the thought. unresolved. The desert opened up ahead wide and pale and empty in the morning light, and she let the thought sit where it was because the alternative was to push it toward a conclusion she was not ready for in a cockpit with 26% fuel and one dark display. She had enough to get home. Barely if she was conservative. She was going to be conservative. What was waiting for her when she got there? That was the question. She let it sit alongside the other one, both of them quiet and patient in the back of her mind, while her hands brought the aircraft home through the pale morning air. The runway at FOB Harrogate was 1.25 miles of concrete that ended at a chain-link perimeter fence, and Claire Voss reached the threshold with 21% fuel and an airspeed slightly too high and a left engine that had been running elevated temperature for 9 minutes. The landing gear came down. All three indicators went green. She did not have time to feel relieved about that because the aircraft was already in the flare and the concrete was coming up and the crosswind at the threshold was running at 14 knots from the northwest. Under ordinary circumstances, manageable. Under these circumstances, not entirely. The front strut hit first. It was not supposed to hit first. The rear gear was designed to contact 0.3 of a second before the nose distributing landing forces across the airframe in the way the airframe was engineered to accept them. A gust cut across the threshold at the wrong moment and pushed the nose down the fraction of a degree that transformed a firm landing into a hard one. And the front strut took the full weight at a descent rate that exceeded its design tolerance by a margin that was not enormous but was sufficient. The strut bent. The nose dropped 4 inches in a single lurching movement that traveled up through the seat and into her spine before she heard the sound of it. The aircraft skidded left the nose yawing against the direction of travel requiring immediate opposite rudder. She put it in. She held the stick back and held the throttle neutral and let the aircraft slow managing the skid rather than fighting it, guiding the deviation, rather than forcing a correction that would make it worse. The aircraft traveled 230 feet of runway in that sideways protesting slide before the speed dropped enough that the nose came around and the remaining momentum carried her forward in something resembling a straight line. She rolled to a stop 60 feet past the taxiway turnoff. She sat with both hands resting on the instrument panel, not gripping, resting the way a person rests their hands on a surface after something physically demanding for contact rather than support. The engines wound down. The cockpit sounds changed as systems went quiet, the sequence of declining noise that meant the machine was returning to being an object rather than an extension of her body. She ran through the shutdown sequence with deliberate care. Master switch, fuel shutoff, electrical, each action complete before the next began. Not because the procedure required full attention, she could do it in her sleep, but because it was a way of marking the transition from the thing she had been doing to the thing that would come next. You did not just stop flying, you finished flying. The difference mattered. She pushed the canopy open. Desert air arrived with the morning heat behind it, dry and warm in the specific way of high-altitude arid country at mid-morning. She breathed it and looked out at the flight line from 12 feet above it. 3 vehicles had stopped in positions, suggesting rapid and uncoordinated arrival. Crew chief's fire response, a plain utility vehicle from the direction of the administrative block. Personnel had gathered in the way people gather around unexpected events, not a crowd, not a formation, the distributed attention of people who have stopped what they were doing because something worth watching has occurred. Nobody moved toward the aircraft. She understood why. She had saved people and violated every directive that applied to her operational status both simultaneously, and the people on the tarmac were processing the simultaneity in real time. The person who had done both of those things at once did not fit neatly into any category they had prepared. She climbed down without waiting for a ladder. Her boots hit the concrete and she started walking. Staff Sergeant Doyle from the crew chief truck reached her first. He had serviced Tempest twice before the grounding and had, without being asked, kept the hangar floor swept and the external surfaces clean during the 22 months the aircraft had sat unused. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Then he gave her a single nod, the kind that carries more weight than its brevity suggests, and stepped aside. She walked past the gathered personnel without stopping. She was not performing composure. She was simply moving in the direction the situation was going to take her regardless. And she had decided long ago that the difference between being led somewhere and walking there yourself was worth maintaining, even when the destination was identical. She saw the vehicle before she reached the administrative block. Black and unmarked, the deliberate blankness of something designed not to attract notice, that therefore attracted a specific kind of notice from people who recognized what deliberate blankness usually meant. 2 men in plain uniforms, no rank, no patches. Major Voss, you'll need to come with us. She looked at him, at the professionally neutral face, at the hands loose at his sides. Am I being charged? No, ma'am. He opened the rear door. She got in. The vehicle moved through the base on a route she tracked automatically past the debriefing wing, past the administrative block, through a gate requiring triple clearance, into a section of the base not on the maps available to personnel at her clearance level. The building they stopped at was low, windowless, unmarked. Concrete walls, keypad entry, no external signage. The kind of building you would walk past without looking at twice if you were not looking for it, and would not find if you were looking in the wrong way. Inside, fluorescent corridors, narrow and mechanical. A room with a single table, two chairs, a pitcher of water with condensation on the glass. A folder closed in the center of the table. A man across from the folder who had been waiting long enough to have arranged himself in the specific stillness of patience rather than inattention. Director Alan Fitch was 67 years old and looked it. His eyes held the quality of someone who had spent decades watching people make decisions under pressure and had drawn conclusions from the aggregate that had not made him more charitable toward human nature, but had made him considerably more precise about it. He did not stand when she entered. He motioned to the chair across from him with a gesture that occupied the space between welcome and directive without committing to either. She sat. Her gloves were still streaked with soot from the cannon housing and marked with the pale dust of the canyon. She was aware that this made her look like what she was, a pilot who had just come out of something, and she decided the look was accurate and therefore appropriate. Fitch opened the folder. He did not look up from it. You violated a no-fly directive. You entered a classified restricted zone without clearance. You engaged targets using munitions not authorized under your current operational status. He turned a page. You caused significant structural damage to a government aircraft. You failed to respond to tower communications on 3 separate occasions. He turned another page. You took off without a flight plan, without a briefing, without a co-signer on the aircraft log, and without notifying anyone in your chain of command. He closed the folder. He looked at her. She said nothing. You saved 6 lives, he said. You neutralized 14 hostile positions. You prevented the destruction of 2 rotary aircraft and their crews. You did all of this in 42 minutes in a canyon the United States military has formally designated a no-go zone for reasons that 8 separate incidents have validated. The room was very quiet. The ventilation system ran below the threshold of active hearing, something you noticed only in complete silence. You don't look concerned, Fitch said. Her voice was level. I've had worse days. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, the rearrangement of a man with considerable control over his face, but perceptible if you were watching closely. He reached into the case beside his chair and placed a second folder on the table. No classification markings, no title, no file number. He opened it and placed 2 photographs side by side. Both were infrared captures, the kind thermal reconnaissance equipment produced. Both showed the same location, the southern ridge above the grave. Cut the promontory she had noted during the mission and assessed as non-threatening because the signature had not moved and had shown no targeting behavior. The first photograph was dated 6 weeks ago. The second was dated November 2024. In both photographs, in the same position on the same promontory, there was a single human figure. Standing. Not crouching, not prone, not in any position a combatant in that terrain would naturally adopt. Standing upright, facing the canyon at an angle so still, it had initially read in the first photograph as residual rock heat rather than a person. She knew that posture. She had seen it first in 2011 at the end of the navigation exercise at Nellis at the edge of a taxiway in late afternoon light. A man who had learned stillness from discipline rather than nature, who stood with his weight balanced in a specific way when he was thinking fully present without being visibly engaged. She had seen it again on the ridge above the first grave cut run through the canopy glass in the second before approach. Geometry demanded her complete attention, and she had filed the image in the folder of things she was not ready to examine. That's not one of ours, she said. No, Fitch said. But you know who it is. Fitch looked at the photographs rather than at her. Lieutenant Colonel James Harker was officially declared killed in action during a classified operation in March of 2023. No body was recovered. No independent verification of the casualty report existed. The report was generated by a single source and processed through a chain of custody that has since been subjected to review. He paused. The review is ongoing. She looked at the first photograph. November 2024. Her first solo run through the grave cut, the mission that had earned her 22 months on a bench in Hangar 4. He was there for Tempest 3, she said. The first run, He watched that one too. Yes. You said he didn't intervene, that I was the only pilot who flew into the grave cut that he didn't intervene with. She was constructing the architecture of it aloud, one element at a time. Except for once. Fitch did not confirm or deny it immediately. The silence was its own confirmation. The frequency, she said, the thermal trap at the second bend, that kind of knowledge requires physical presence. You can't map a trap from a static image. You have to be there with eyes on the canyon in real time, and you have to know the terrain well enough to read the deviation from what should be there. She stopped. Then, he prepared the aircraft. Fitch folded his hands on the table. We have assessed, based on the pattern of his observed movements in the timeline of the aircraft's maintenance anomalies, that Harker has been operating independently in this region for approximately 18 months. He has made no contact with any official channel. He has not identified himself to any personnel. He has been observed in elevated terrain positions relative to 3 separate active operations. Each time without engaging, each time simply observing. He looked at her directly now. You were the only variable that changed his behavior. Why? Because you were the only pilot who flew into the canyon and came back, and because the second time, something more significant was at stake. He paused. He gave you what you needed to survive. He did not give it to anyone before you. He has not given it to anyone since. The room stayed quiet. The ventilation hummed at its sub-threshold frequency. He's testing me, she said. He's been answering a question. There's a difference. Fitch's voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying this information for a long time and had developed a precise relationship with its implications. Harker disappeared because he found something, not on a foreign battlefield. On domestic soil, the network that has been operating through this region, the logistics chain, the weapons transfers, it doesn't originate outside the country. It has a source inside it. He has been tracing that source independently for 18 months, because he determined at some point that the official channels for doing so were not safe to use. She was very still. 8 months ago, Fitch continued, Stormglass established surveillance on the network operating through this region. We were not trying to destroy it. We were mapping it, following the threads back toward the domestic source. The individuals inside that canyon were critical nodes. They connected to the supply chain through channels we had spent 8 months identifying. He stopped. You burned them in 42 minutes. She absorbed this. She let it sit in the arrangement of things she now knew. The serial numbers, she said, the manpads that fired on the Chinook. Kerrigan's analysis confirmed it within 2 hours of your landing. The serial numbers traced to a logistics inventory reported loss from a domestic facility 14 months ago. Not black market, not foreign acquisition, domestic diversion. Someone with access to military inventory and the bureaucratic cover to move equipment out of it without triggering immediate detection. His voice was flat, and the flatness was deliberate, the tone of a man presenting information that he knows is volatile and is choosing to present without theater. That is what Harker found. That is what we have been building toward. That is what you interrupted. She looked at him steadily. So I'm here because I know too much. You're here because you are, by every assessment in your file, not the kind of person who leaves knowledge unexamined. And because what you know, if it surfaces through unofficial channels before we are ready, destroys the investigation and potentially warns the domestic source. He reached into his case. He placed a fabric patch on the table between them. Black background, no unit name, no number. A single word stitched in gray thread, hand done with the care of something made deliberately rather than produced in quantity. Stormglass. She looked at it. She knew the name, had heard it twice in context she had filed as unverifiable institutional rumor. A program that operated outside standard oversight. Personnel who appeared in no official roster. She had heard it and set it aside as the kind of legend that accumulates around programs too classified for the explanation to be shared. You're not recruiting me, she said. The understanding arriving complete the way conclusions arrive when the evidence has been arranged long enough. You need to contain what I know. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected this and had prepared to be honest about it. Inside this program, your knowledge becomes an asset we can use. Outside it, your knowledge is a problem that resolves itself in ways that are not good for you and not good for the investigation. He did not apologize for the directness. Those are the 2 positions available to you. She looked at the patch on the table. She thought about 8 months of surveillance, about a domestic logistics chain moving military weapons through channels maintained by people with official access, about the specific kind of person who builds that kind of system, not impulsively, not crudely, but with the patience and structural knowledge of someone embedded in the institution they are corrupting. She thought about 1983, about a room she would never enter and a decision made in it, about the kind of system that makes that decision, not because it is composed of evil people, but because it has developed mechanisms for certain kinds of choices, and mechanisms that exist get used, and the same mechanism used once will be used again if nothing changes what makes it available. She thought about Harker standing on a promontory in the cold morning, watching her fly, not stopping her, not helping except once, and even then with information rather than intervention, the way he had always taught. Not doing it for you, making sure you had what you needed, then watching what you did with it. She thought about her father's dog tags in the recess beside the main display, and about the 14 hours of signal in November 1983, and about the questions she had been carrying for 43 years. Not as grief, as unfinished business. As the specific open account that a pilot keeps in the back of her mind, the way she keeps an instrument reading that is still running but has not yet been confirmed. The domestic source, the chain of custody that Harker had traced independently for 18 months, the review of his casualty report that remained ongoing, the specific question of what a man who had discovered something that dangerous would do and who he would trust and what he was waiting for before he moved. She picked up the patch. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the stitching, the texture of the fabric, the particular density of something made by hand. Then she looked at Fitch across the table. I'll need full access to Harker's operational logs for the past 18 months. He looked at her. If I'm inside this program, I'm inside it completely. Not on a need-to-know basis that you define and redefine according to what's convenient. Full access to everything you have on Harker, on the domestic source, and on the 1983 mission that lost Captain Elliot Voss. She let the name sit in the room. All of it. Something moved across Fitch's expression. Not surprised he was not a man who surprised easily, but the specific recalibration of someone who has been playing a longer game than he acknowledged and has just received information that the other player may also be playing one. The 1983 connection, he said, is not a coincidence, she said. You know it isn't. A domestic network with this kind of access and this kind of longevity does not appear fully formed. It has history. It has precedents. It has decisions that were made before any of the people currently running it were in the positions they currently hold. She paused. My father's signal transmitted for 14 hours. Someone made a decision about that signal. I want to know who made it and what they were connected to. The room was very quiet. Fitch looked at the closed folder and then at the open one and then at her. We'll discuss parameters, he said. Not yes, but the specific kind of not yes that meant the conversation was not finished and the door was not closed. She had negotiated enough approaches to know the difference between a wall and a locked door, and this was a locked door, and she had just demonstrated she knew it was there. She placed the patch in the right breast pocket of her flight suit. Not the left. The left pocket was already occupied, had been occupied for 43 years, and its occupant did not need company. It needed resolution. She stood. I'll need the aircraft ready for operational readiness within 48 hours. That's already been arranged, Fitch said. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She turned back. The aircraft was prepared 6 days ago, he said. He held her eyes without expression. We have been waiting to see what you would do with it. She stood at the door for a moment, with this placed alongside everything else. 6 days, 3 days before Calloway's team went into the canyon. Before anyone at FOB Harrogate had reason to say her name in a communications tent. Before the sequence of events that had brought her to this room had begun its visible motion. Not Harker alone, or not only Harker. Something larger had been in motion, and she had been one of its components placed in position before the operation began. She did not know yet how much of what had happened was improvised and how much was arranged. She did not know where Fitch's interest and Harker's interest converged and where they had diverged. She did not know what Harker was waiting for before he made contact. She filed all of it under unresolved alongside the questions she had been carrying since she was 9 years old and walked out. 2 weeks later, an airstrip that did not appear on any navigational database open to standard military personnel was quiet at 0600, except for the sound of a crew chief completing a final walkthrough. The building at the end of the strip had no designation. The personnel who moved through it wore no insignia. The aircraft on the tarmac had been repainted, restructured, and upgraded in ways that did not appear in any maintenance log connected to the designation it used to carry. It was no longer Tempest 3. The name on the fuselage was simple and precise, painted in block letters behind the cockpit in the same gray as the stitching on the patch in her right breast pocket. Stormglass. Claire Voss completed the pre-flight circuit herself. She always would. It was not a ritual she intended to abbreviate or delegate the physical act of knowing the machine before trusting it with what mattered. She moved around the aircraft with practiced economy, touching surfaces, reading panel indicators, testing the control surfaces through their range by hand. Everything was clean. Everything was ready. The avionics ran faster than Tempest 3 had run in years. The diagnostics populated immediately and without hesitation. Colonel Marcus Webb was at the edge of the tarmac when she came around the nose. He had been there for a while, she could tell from the paper coffee cup in his hand, which had cooled past the temperature of something a person still intends to drink. He did not pretend he had arrived recently. He did not explain what he was doing there. He simply raised the cup slightly. Not a toast, not a salute, something older and less formal than either, and held her eyes for a moment before looking at the aircraft behind her. He had known it when it was Tempest 3 marked and scarred and grounded. He had known her when she sat on a bench beside it and waited. That history was not nothing, and he knew she knew it was not nothing, and neither of them needed to say it. She nodded once. She walked to the cockpit. Kerrigan was on the ground frequency when she ran the startup sequence. His investigation of the 0340 terminal axis had been ongoing for 2 weeks. The thread it connected to was longer and darker than the initial anomaly had suggested, and he had spent 14 days following it with the careful attention of a young officer who has realized he is looking at something that will define the next decade of his career and possibly end it if he looks at it wrong. He had not spoken to her about it directly. She had read his preliminary report, 3 pages of cautious language that nonetheless managed to say this goes higher than a logistics clerk and further back than 14 months. She had read it and thought about 1983 and said nothing to anyone. Stormglass, Kerrigan said, "You are clear for departure. No elevation ceiling, flight path open." She looked at the instrument panel, all green. The left display that had gone dark in the canyon was replaced and performing perfectly. The fuel was full. The stabilizers were exact. She reached into her left breast pocket. The dog tags were where they had always been. She took them out and placed them in the recess without ceremony or paused the motion, as automatic now as trimming the aircraft for altitude or checking the fuel state, something the body did without consulting the mind, because the mind had agreed to it decades ago, and the agreement did not require renewal each time. She did not need the ritual today. She needed the fact of it. They were there. She was here. The question was still open. The account was still unresolved. But the position from which she was pursuing the resolution had changed, and that was not nothing. She released the brake and pushed the throttle forward. Stormglass rolled down the strip with the ease of an aircraft that had been prepared by people who knew what they were preparing it for. She came around to the runway heading, and the desert opened ahead of her, and pale in the early light, the horizon sharp against the sky that was still deciding between blue and gold at the edge of the world. She accelerated. The concrete blurred beneath the gear, and then the gear lifted, and the tarmac became the terrain, became the landscape, everything below, organizing itself into pattern and distance as the altitude built, the complications of the ground remaining complicated but visible, the way they always were from up here, not simplified by altitude, but clarified the shape of them, readable in ways they were not when you were standing inside them. She leveled off and turned east, not toward the canyon, not today, toward the broader country that contained the canyon, the geography that extended past it in every direction. Somewhere in that geography and terrain that a man could reach without a road and hold without equipment, a figure might be standing in the early light, looking up, watching a gray aircraft climb away from an unmarked strip. She did not know if Harker was there. She knew he was somewhere alive, operating following the thread that had led him to disappear from the official record and reappear as a thermal signature on an infrared photograph. She knew he had taught her what she needed to know to survive the thing she had just survived. She knew he had watched her twice and intervened once, and that the intervention had been exactly sufficient and nothing more. She knew, or was close enough to knowing, that the gap was a matter of evidence rather than intuition, that the thread he was following and the thread Fitch was following ran toward the same source. And she knew because she had spent 43 years with an unresolved account and had learned to read the shape of things through the shape of what was missing, that the source was not only in a canyon or a foreign logistics chain or a domestic weapons diversion. The source was in a room where a person with the necessary clearance and the necessary insulation from consequence had made a decision more than once, possibly many times, where the mechanism existed and was used because it had been built to be used and had been used before and had never been dismantled, because the people who would dismantle it were inside the architecture it protected. She had spent her entire life outside that room, looking at its effects. Living in the aftermath of a decision made inside it in November of 1983, in the cold middle of a Cold War that the people who made the decision believed outweighed one RF-4C pilot's beacon signal. She was inside the architecture now. Inside it deliberately with the patch in her right pocket and the dog tags in the recess beside her main display, and the specific knowledge of a woman who had spent 43 years preparing without being able to name what she was preparing for to be exactly where she was. Kerrigan's thread was 14 months old. Fitch's investigation was 8 months old. Harker had been following this for 18. She intended to find out how far it went before any of them started counting. Storm glass climbed into the morning, and the desert fell away beneath her, and the sky opened ahead in the specific blue of high altitude, a blue that had no patience for the complications of the ground below it and no interest in the rooms where decisions were made. From up here, everything was visible. The shape of the terrain, the pattern of the roads, the geometry of the structures from this height indistinguishable from each other, a forward operating base, and a windowless building and a domestic logistics facility all reduced to the same category places where people made choices for reasons that could be understood if you got close enough to them and examined. She was going to get close enough. She thought of her father pointing at a contrail, crossing a winter sky, and saying in the simple voice of a man explaining something he considered self-evident, "That's where we go." He had gone. He had not come back. But 43 years later, his daughter was up there too, and she was going somewhere specific, and she had more information than she had ever had before, and she was not planning on leaving until she had found what she came for. Stormglass leveled at altitude. The horizon stretched ahead enormous and detailed and full of things that had not yet been seen from this angle. She pointed the aircraft toward it and flew.